There's a movie called Big Fish. How many people have seen the movie Big Fish? Yeah, it wasn't like a big blockbuster or anything, but an interesting story of the main character's life from a young boy to an old man. And one key element of the story, one thing that always sticks with me, is as a young boy, he is shown how he's going to die. And because of that, as you think about the implications, it changes his perspective on things. He has total lack of fear in all these situations that he faces prior to that because he knows, I'm not going to die now. This isn't how I was shown I'm going to die. And what something to know, again, to be able to have that perspective changing experience. Well, there's something similar in the Bible. There's a verse that can change our perspective just as much. And the bad news is it is largely misunderstood. The good news is the correct understanding of it, as I understand it at least, is even more significant because it's more personal. I'm talking about Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. It says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." I'm sure we've all heard that verse, and we've probably heard what that means is once Jesus establishes the church, Satan and hell and the power of hell will not wipe it out at any time before Jesus comes back. And that's a good promise, but it's not what that verse is promising. What is that verse promising? How do we understand it? And the key to understanding that verse is actually found in a verse that talks about some keys in the book of Revelation, which is a little ironic that Revelation's so hard to understand in some ways is the key to understanding this verse. And you remember the last major holiday, Christmas, we took an unexpected passage. We looked at the book of Revelation for our Christmas passage. Well, that same chapter 12 of Revelation actually ties into today as well. It kicks us off. And you'll look, the key passages are on the handout today because we're going to be looking at a few of them. But Revelation chapter 12, starting at verse 1, it says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." Now, we said about that, and we didn't go into huge detail then, and certainly not this morning, but the son is obviously Jesus, the child who is born. And at first thought, then you think, well, the woman has to be Mary. But you read the whole chapter and you see it's not that simple. It seems to be the people of God. That at first it's Old Testament Israel. The reason God called and chose this nation was to bring about Jesus. But then later in the chapter, it talks about what goes on with that woman. And it shifts from the Old Testament people of God to the New Testament people, the church. Anyone, Jew or Gentile, who accepts Jesus. And so that's the woman. Well, the red dragon, as we can tell, is Satan. And it says that Satan was waiting to devour the child. And it says in the NIV, at the moment he was born, really it's when he was born. And you also see in this passage, as Revelation does, it sort of condenses time in some ways, because one verse there, she gave birth to a son, Jesus, and then her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So that's the beginning of his life and the end of his life, his ascension to heaven. And we said that all these efforts of the red dragon, of Satan, to kill the child, they started certainly with Herod and his attempt to kill the baby boys, including he tried Jesus in Bethlehem. Then later on in Jesus' ministry, there were some times where the Jewish leaders tried to kill him. But of course, the one where at least there was some temporary success is what we remember this weekend, the cross. Satan was successful for a few days. Well, that's what we're keying on here. The dragon succeeds temporarily, and that's what brings us. That's what we're talking about today. Good Friday, Easter Sunday. And I want to look now, in light of that, look at Revelation 1. Because it talks about this as well, and it's going to give us insight then into what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 16. In Revelation 1, first of all, John the Apostle, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples, he says that he's on the Isle of Patmos, which was this place where the Romans, the government, would put people that they weren't happy with. He'd exiled them there. You go here, stay here, you can't leave. He was there for being a Christian. And he says one Sunday morning, that as he was worshiping, he hears a voice. And it says, I'm going to give you a vision. I want you to write what you're going to see to the 7 churches in Asia. 7 churches that were real churches then, but they also represent things that happened in the church all throughout history. Well, it says there, and this is on your handout, verse 12. John says, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. Imagine seeing that. You know, the impact that would have as you see this person, this being standing in front of you. Well, it has that effect on John. Verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Just about fainted, passed out at seeing that. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Jesus there is talking about his death and his resurrection. Do you ever stop and think about it? You know, resurrections weren't common in Bible times. In fact, the whole Bible, it wasn't like, every other day someone's coming back to life. Hey, John, wonder if you'd be, wonder when you'd be back. It didn't happen. You add it up, and there are 3 resurrections in the Old Testament. And I looked it up. We mentioned on Tuesday night the one with Elisha's bones. I got the details straight. Elisha, some people were burying a man, and they saw some raiders coming, some marauders, and so they throw this body of this person who had recently died into Elisha's tomb where his bones were still there, and again, they would share those things, and he comes back to life just by touching Elisha's bones. And so that's one of 3 resurrections in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, there are 5 that are specific, that tell us about an individual who was raised. Then there was also, when Jesus died on the cross, it says that many people came back to life. And so we don't know how many those were, but one instance, many people. And then a lot of people think also Paul, when it says that he was stoned and left for dead, and he got up, he may well have been dead. And that may be when he had the vision taken up into the 3rd heaven. So still, there's not very many. Their resurrections, Jesus was not the only one, but there weren't very many. But there were some things about Jesus' resurrection that was unique. Of course, the biggest things is what his death did. Jesus' resurrection came after his death for sins, and he was able to do that because he was the Son of God. Certainly those things are in a different category. But there's something else about Jesus, and it comes out here in this verse. What is the fate of everyone else who was resurrected? They eventually died again. Yet none of those people are still walking around. None of those people who were brought back to life in the Old Testament or the New Testament, none of those people, they all died again. But look what Jesus says in verse 18. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever. I came back to life, and I'm not going to die again. It says in Romans, death no longer is master over him. Jesus is unique in that way. He is never going to die again, but he's also unique. Look what it says at the end of that verse. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. What's that mean? First of all, what is death and Hades? We know death, and these two are linked together often, certainly in the book of Revelation. Death and Hades. Well, Hades is the abode of the dead, so to speak. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word was Sheol. In the New Testament, the Greek word is Hades. And it's this idea of the grave at times, where the body is, certainly where the spirit is. It's linked to death, and that's why they're tied together there. Well, and one thing to realize too, and sometimes we forget this even as Christians, obviously we are created to have a body and a spirit, a soul. And are those two distinct? Some people say yes, some people say no. A lot of times we think when the body goes, well, that's not really the person. It is. God created us. We're not fully alive unless we have a body and a spirit. And so a person who's died, their spirit is still alive, still awake. It doesn't sleep. But there's something unnatural, something that goes against the way God intended when the body and the spirit are not together. Well, look what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about, I hold the keys of death and Hades. He's picturing Hades sort of like a prison. And if you think about it, prior to this, there had been jailbreaks out of the prison of death and Hades. People who had gone in, they got out for a little bit, right? But they were recaptured. They came back. They died again. Well, Jesus says, I'm alive. I've escaped death and Hades, and I'm alive forever and ever. I'm not going back. No one can take me back. Death has no power over me anymore. And then he also adds this detail. I have the keys of death and Hades. Well, the keys to what? Is it a safe in the back room? A back bedroom? What's he have the keys to? He has the keys to the gates of Hades. Jesus has the keys to the gates of Hades. Well, now take that and let's look at this Matthew passage. In Matthew 16, Jesus asks his disciples, who do the people say I am? And they're not quite sure. Some of them say you're John the Baptist, from the dead. Some of them say you're Jeremiah, back from the dead. Other prophets, all kinds of answers, Jesus. And then in verse 15, but Jesus says, what about you? Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. In other words, it wasn't like you just heard this on the street. Well, word on the street is, flesh and blood from other people. No, God revealed this to you. How? Well, through the miracles Jesus did. Peter and others could tell, you're from God. And then Jesus says, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And we looked at this a few weeks ago, and we said, the Catholics have taken this and made Peter the Pope. Well, the non-Catholics have gone to the opposite extreme and says it has nothing to do with Peter. No, you're Peter, a rock, and upon this rock, upon you and the other apostles we see later in the Bible, I'm going to build my church. And then Jesus says this thing that is so often misunderstood, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And I know you've all heard it just like I have. What's that mean? That means that Satan and hell, the church is going to be established with Jesus, and all throughout the time, the hundreds, thousands of years now it's been, however long it is, Satan will never overpower the church. The church will not go out of existence. Have you heard that? Yeah, it's very, very common. That's what this is taken to mean. But there's some problems with that. First of all, the word is Hades, not hell. Usually when you hear that, what do people say? The gates of hell. The powers of hell, right? Well, there's a separate word for hell in the New Testament. It's Gehenna. This is the word Hades. And the confusion started with the King James. They took Gehenna and Hades and they translated them all as hell. Most modern translations have done a more accurate, more literal translation. The one that I found that surprised me, the English Standard Version, everywhere else in the New Testament it says Hades, they translate it Hades. Here where it says Hades, they still put hell. So they still continue this confusion, the gates of hell. It's not the gates of hell, it's the gates of Hades. Hell is the final place of torment and punishment God designed for the demons. No one is in hell yet. Hades, again, is like death. It's the abode of the dead. It's the grave. So it's the gates of Hades, and that's really the problem right there. Did it ever strike you as strange? The gates of Hades will not overpower the church. It makes it sound like gates are an offensive weapon. That makes no sense. A city that was going to attack another city didn't take their own gates off the hinges and carry them over here to attack this city. It doesn't fit. Well, I read some, and the people try to interpret it this way. They say, well, a gates represented the power of a city. If your city had powerful gates, you were a powerful city, so it's talking about the power of hell. And I'm like, really? How about we get a little more simple? And how about you look at the other passages? What's this talking about? One thing, when it says will not overcome it, the word can be shall not prevail against it. And I think that's the better way. The gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. It's going to be a contest between the gates and the church, and the gates won't win. But what are gates intended to do? Keep people either in or out, right? Well, in this case, the gates of Hades, what are they intended to do? They don't really keep people out. You know, it's not like we have trouble getting into death. Like, oh, I tried to die and I just couldn't do it. You know, couldn't get in. The gates were closed. No, the gates of Hades don't keep people out. They do keep people in, though. Once people die, they can't get out. That's what Jesus is talking about. And he's making reference to the fact that the gates of Hades, up until this point, and even from his life on, because he hasn't used the keys yet, the gates have always prevailed. People die, they go into Hades, and they can't get out. And those lucky few who escape for a while, they're brought right back in, and then they can't get out. But Jesus has changed all that. Jesus died. He was in Hades. He was behind those gates. But when his time is, according to his will and God's will, when he said the time is done, those gates couldn't hold him. He walked out the gates, and he says in Revelation, I took the keys with me. Jesus has the keys to the gates of Hades. And that's why the gates of Hades won't prevail against the church. Because when the time is right, Jesus is going to go and unlock the gates of Hades, and everyone's going to get out. That's what this verse is talking about. Well, we should always ask, and we've been making this habit, why include that? Why do you mention that? Well, you know, the one answer would be because people die. And so we sort of want to know, okay, what happens after I die? Is that all there is? And so the passage in Revelation, the passage in Matthew, they're saying no. But there's even more as Christians, because everyone dies. But the Bible makes it clear, if you're a Christian, there's even worse news. Because it's not just that you're subject to the laws of nature and physical death and everything that can affect other people. In Revelation 12, that passage that we looked at Christmas, it goes on and it says, the dragon at first fights against the woman, against the church, and cannot destroy the church. He tries. Well, then he turns his attention from the church as a whole to individuals. And in verse 17 of Revelation chapter 12, it says, Then the dragon was enraged at the woman because he couldn't destroy the church as a whole, and he went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Who's the rest of the woman's offspring? Christians. Yeah. The devil, the dragon, is waging war against believers. Main idea today that I want us to see, again, as we begin to see how this all fits together, and I put it there, knowing death is not the end gives an entirely different perspective on life. Knowing death is not the end gives an entirely different perspective on life. It doesn't change necessarily what happens, but it changes your perspective. The other day, Lisa and I were coming back from lunch, and she was switching lanes, and apparently a car almost hit our car. It was real close. She said, that really scared me. She said, did it scare you? I said, no, not at all. It wasn't because I'm braver than her. I didn't see it. She had a whole different perspective. And so, again, the same situation. She's scared about it. I'm not. Why? Well, because I didn't have that perspective. See how perspective changes things that you experience? You can react, act, be settled or not, different from someone else. Well, in Revelation, John is writing to these 7 churches, and they're all beginning to experience persecution, not just from the Jews, but now from the Romans, specifically as Christians. At first, it was the Romans just lumped Jews and Christians together. Now it's specifically as Christians. They're starting to be put together. They were experiencing persecution. Jesus had just said in Matthew, you remember, it's in 16, we read this verse. Back in 10, he sent out the disciples to spread the news. And you remember what he said? Hey guys, just so you know, and it was more of a warning about the future, not that trip. Well, here's what's going to come. You're going to be dragged into the synagogues and flogged. And he says also, don't be afraid of those who kill the body, but can't kill the spirit. Well, what's that saying? There's going to be people who kill your bodies. That's what's coming. This is the first time the word church is used in Matthew by Jesus. He says, I want you to know, church, here's what awaits you. You, because you are believers, are going to be attacked by Satan. You're going to be people on earth that are working through him, with him. They're going to kill you. You're going to be persecuted. So let me tell you, this world is not all there is. Knowing death is not the end gives an entirely different perspective on life. In a few ways, first of all, just what we've been saying, it gives you hope in the face of persecution. It says in 2 Timothy 3:12, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. How many people have that up on your refrigerator at home? Now, when's the last time you saw that one flip around on the K-Love verse of the day? It's not a real popular verse, but it's there. Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Maybe direct persecution, people trying to harm you or take your life. That certainly happened in the early church. It happened to those people John was writing to. It happened to the disciples. All but one of them died for their faith. And even John, who was exiled, didn't have an easy life. Happened to other Christians. They were burned at the stake. They were used as torches, as lamps in Rome. They were put in the Colosseum. It's happened throughout history. And it continues to happen today. And we're finally starting to see it. It used to be the idea of Christian martyrs today, like, oh, I can't even believe it. But now we're seeing it. You know, Carol made reference, the school that was attacked this week. 150 Christians were killed for being Christians. The Muslim terrorists went in and asked, are you a Christian or a Muslim? If they were a Muslim, they let them go. If they were a Christian, they shot them. Those people were persecuted, martyred, because they were Christians. How about us? Well, we're starting to see some things, not physical oppression and persecution, but we're definitely starting to see things here in our country. I don't know there's any way you can say, well, it's probably just going to be a trend and then get better. I don't know. Don't think so. There's going to be direct persecution. There's definitely going to be spiritual attacks. And it says in 1 Peter, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. That's what Satan is doing. How'd you spend your Saturday? Well, Satan spent his prowling around looking for a Christian to devour, trying to bring something difficult into your life, not just kill you necessarily, but undermine your faith. That's what he did yesterday. It's what he does every day. And so you stop and think about it. If this life was all there was, if you, after you're born, you live so many years and you die, if this life was it, and being a Christian lowered your life expectancy, chances are you're going to be killed early for being a Christian. Oh, and your life's going to be more difficult because you're a Christian? Who's signing up for that? And who's saying, oh, that's what I want then? That's why the Bible is making this point. This isn't all there is. Have a different perspective. Knowing death is not the end gives an entirely different perspective on life. The Jews needed to hear that. Jewish Christians need to hear it. They had this tradition in Judaism. They believe that, I'm going to die, but there's going to be something about a resurrection. Don't quite understand it, but they had that basic idea. But at the same time, they did have a group of people that were pretty influential then, the Sadducees, who were saying, no, there is no resurrection. So you have to imagine some of them were wondering. And not only that, they'd had this belief for hundreds, thousands of years. What proof had they seen up to this point that there's going to be a general resurrection? Everyone's coming back. Nothing. And so this was written to Jewish Christians to say, hey, I just want to reassure you and give you the basis. Here's what Jesus did. He is in control of death. The gates of Hades will not prevail against you. He's got the keys. It was written to Gentile Christians. Gentiles, they had this Greek philosophy, and they had this crazy idea that, it's throughout all their philosophy and their writings, that the physical world is evil, matter is evil, and spirit is good. And it had all kinds of implications, but one was, it'd be better to be dead. Get rid of this body and just be dead. Now, not very many people followed through on it, because, again, okay, I can test out the theory, but, not quite sure how it works. So it wasn't like they all committed suicide, like would be the logical implication. But it is the reason Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, when he preaches the cross and Jesus coming back to life, the Gentiles, the Greeks, say what? It's foolishness. Why? Because they're like, well, once you get rid of this body, who in the world wants to come back to it? It's foolishness to the Gentiles. They needed to be clarified, like, no, life is being a body and a spirit. And a Christian is going to experience that eventually. He's going to be reunited with a body and live for eternity. And for us, I think for us, maybe We need a reminder of the eternal perspective on duration of life. You know, we look at this life, and I realize it seems so long at times. Trust me, I'm with you. Oh, this life seems so long, but it's really not. And that should put things in perspective. You know, if you started off a year, say you started off 2015, and January 1st was a bad day. I don't know what happened, but everything that could go wrong went wrong. But then every other day of this year was a great day. Looking back on it, how would you describe 2015? We'd have to say it was a good year, right? If you had one bad day and 364 good days, wouldn't we all say, oh, that was a good year? Well, think about this life in terms of eternity with God. You know, we're not even talking about 365th now. You know, if the first minute of January 15 were bad and everything else, we're starting to get closer to that. Eternity gives us a perspective of duration of this life. And so it gives us hope in the face of persecution. Whether it's persecution, whether it's trials, whatever, this life is not all there is. There's a lot more coming. I also thought about it. It gives us priorities in the midst of distractions. You know, again, knowing death is not the end gives a different perspective. It gives us different priorities. The Bible tells us be in the world but not of the world. You know, Jesus says, don't take these people out of the world. The whole plan for spreading the news, they've got to be in it. But over and over, the Bible says, don't be of it. Don't live like the world does. That's tough, isn't it? Because we are in the world, and we see the things of the world, and boy, that looks good. And living this way, that looks like the best way. And, oh, God, I can't see how living for you is really going to pan out. It's tough, isn't it? You know, and I think an external motivation, just being told, hey, do it. Live in the world but not of the world. Okay, got it, do it. That's tough to do. That's tough to follow through. I can do that sometimes, but when things are really difficult, I can't. I can't follow through. I can't obey just because I'm supposed to do it. You know, I wrote a script a while ago. It was about this amazing family from Indonesia. This woman named Adele, her and her family got caught up in the Christian and Muslim violence there about 15 years ago. And she was a Christian, and prior to that, again, she lived her life, and she says now it was very legalistic. I did what I was supposed to do. Why? Because I was supposed to do it. I was told, Christians do it. Okay, I did it. I mean, she even married her husband to keep peace. She didn't love him. She told him that later. I didn't love you at first. Came to love you. Well, when her village is attacked, her son and her mother-in-law are killed. She's captured. Her daughter is captured. She's forced to marry a man. She's forced to have a kid with him. And just everything that happens there, she escapes. And she knows as a Christian, I'm supposed to forgive them. That's what I'm supposed to do. And she said, I couldn't do it just because I was supposed to. It wasn't until the grace of Christ, the love of God came alive, and it gave her an internal motivation. It gave her a different perspective to know what Jesus did for me and what waits for eternity for me and for everyone else. And now she not only forgives her Muslim captors and all of them, she says, I want to go and preach the gospel to them so they can spend eternity in heaven. It changes things. And sometimes as Christians, not only do we need an eternal perspective on the duration of life, we need an internal perspective on the value of life. What's really important here? In Matthew 6, Jesus said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. We spend so much time on things that fade away, that end, and we don't give thought to the things that are going to last for eternity, things I can do now that have an eternal impact. It says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Hear me in this. Physical treasures, physical things are not evil. Matter of fact, the Bible says God gives us all things for our enjoyment. But are we really enjoying some of these things, or are we just trying to keep up and let people around us see them? I often say the test is, could you enjoy it if no one knew you had it? If no one was going to see whatever you bought or this or that, would you still enjoy it, or are you doing it just because you want people to see that? And even then, again, when I stack it up in terms of, okay, what I do now with my time and my money compared to eternal value, how's it fit? Knowing this life is not all there is gives an entirely different perspective on life. Also, I think it gives a different perspective in terms of priority of relying on God versus relying on ourselves. The priority, in the midst of distractions, it's so easy to get distracted in this world and think it all depends on me. It all depends on me. I've got to work hard. God, help me out, but I know it's really me. It gives a different perspective. How did Jesus come back to life in the first place? It was the power of God. The verse that I cited in the prayer time, Philippians 3. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings. God, I want that in my life, your power. Why? Because compared to your power, I can't even cure. My daughter's home with a cold or a fever. I can't even cure a cold. God can raise the dead. Who do I really want to rely on? But who do we often rely on? I rely on myself instead of the one who can raise the dead. It gives a different perspective on that. And then the last thing, again, knowing death is not the end, gives an entirely different perspective on life. It gives us urgency in light of eternity. Now, up to this point, we've been assuming something. When Jesus lets people out of Hades, we've been talking about us, about believers, about Christians. We've been assuming that the people coming out of the gates of Hades are going to spend eternity with God. That's not true of everyone. Revelation 20, again on your handout, John writes this. He says, Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave, and it goes back, and then verse 13 is really sort of looking at it from the beginning again. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. It's the death of death there. There will be no more death. It's going to be thrown into hell. The lake of fire is the second death, eternal death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. You see what that's saying? There's going to be a resurrection. At judgment, Jesus is going to open those gates of Hades. Everyone who's ever died is going to come out and be judged. First of all, we're going to be judged according to what's written in the books, plural. That's the scene that we always imagine. Standing before God, and he reads off, okay, here's what you did, here's what you did, here's what you did. How do you think we're going to fare? Not so good. When the standard is perfection, have you been as holy, as righteous as God? Perfection is the standard. Pass or fail. We're all going to fail. But then look what it says. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So we're all going to be judged according to what we've done, and we all fail. But then there's the second element of judgment. Has your name been written in the book of life? If so, then you spend eternity with God. Well, how does your name get written in the book of life? You look back at Matthew 16, the verse that I didn't read that's on your handout. Verse 19, Jesus says to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I'll give you the keys. Peter, you and the other disciples, you go out and you tell people, here's how you enter the kingdom of heaven. Here's how your name is written in the book of life. And it should be whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. It's not like Peter gets to make it up and say, all right, I'm deciding, here's what you got to do. God is saying, I've determined it, you relay it for me. And whatever you say, you're relaying what's already established in heaven. Here's how you get in the kingdom. Here's what you have to do. Here's what you don't have to do. And what does Peter and the Bible say? Well, it says you need to believe in Jesus, that he's the Son of God, died for sins and rose from the dead. It says you need to repent. You need to make that turn, that commitment, sign that blank sheet and says, God, I will live for you. Not perfectly, but wholly committed. No parts of my life off the table. And then the Bible says you have to be baptized. And so as we talk about this urgency in light of eternity, one thing for people is I've got to accept it personally. I have to personally accept this offer that was made. I need to believe in these things. And if you're here today, or if you know some that aren't today and they don't believe in that, you got to stop and think about it. Have you really examined the facts? I talk to people, well, I'm not sure I believe. Okay, well, find out. This is the most important thing. This is talking about where you'll spend eternity. Find out if it's true. And I used to think everyone believed that Jesus lived and died. You know, they didn't deny he was the Son of God and stuff, but I thought everyone knew he lived. And I saw someone on CNN recently who denied that there even was a Jesus. I'm like, really? I thought that was pretty well established. And it should be, because there are passages outside of the Bible that talk about Jesus. You know, one man, Tacitus, who was a senator in Rome in around 116, wrote, consequently, to get rid of this report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. You know, when Rome burned and people said, Nero, did you do this? He said, no, it was the Christians. He pushed the blame on them. Tacitus is recording this. He says, these people called Christians, Christus, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Here's someone who's not in the Bible at all. He says Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate through the most extreme penalty. The Romans knew that's talking about crucifixion. It was so bad you couldn't crucify a Roman citizen. You had to kill him some other way. So he says Christ was crucified by Pilate. There's evidence outside the Bible. Jesus lived and he died. Well, then you have to face the question, all right, what happened then? And stop and think. There are no credible alternatives to the resurrection. What happened to the body? And we're not going to take the time to go over all those, but there aren't any. And if you want some more information about that, I've got some books, More Than a Carpenter. You've seen those. We've always used those for a long time. If you want one of those, if you want one of those for someone else, we've got some now. You can get some after the service. Find out, you know, the urgency in light of eternity. There is an eternal destiny I have to accept. And then the last thing I want us to realize, the urgency in light of eternity, for us as believers, we have to connect. And at first I was just going to say spread the word. We need to tell others about Jesus. But I think sometimes, you know, sometimes people don't even tell them. But other times it's like, they're just real quick. You know, let me just hand you a postcard and move on. We have to connect with people around us, our friends, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers, and not to make them targets, but to show the same love of God that he's shown to us. You know, Matthew said, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. It's as you're going, as you're living your life, connect with these people and realize there is going to be an eternal judgment. If I've accepted, that's great, but I need to talk to you about where you are. And to do so, it can't be the first words out of my mouth. Do you know about Jesus? They're probably going to run the other way. Connect with them. Well, let's close up this morning. What do I need to do? What do I need to do? And I put it on your handout, and I worded it instead of, okay, since Jesus rose from the dead and there's eternity, how should my life be different? Let me ask it this way. What would be different about my life if I did not believe in Jesus' resurrection? Because that sort of shows, all right, where's the base? You know, here's where if I didn't believe this, if I'm here believing it today, if I didn't believe it, how much would my life be different? And if the answer to some of these is not very much, that shows you I need to start applying this to my life. You know, hope in the face of persecution. And I realize we aren't persecuted, but did you see what happened? You know, I've mentioned it. Those people, the Egyptian Christians who were killed by ISIS, do you hear about it? They were singing hymns as they were about to be killed. Their relatives talk about the privilege of dying for Christ. You think these people believed in eternity after this life? Absolutely. It had a huge impact on their life. Well, what about me, the things I face, whether it's persecution or just trials? If I didn't believe there's life after death, how differently would I face those things? Sometimes I look at it and like, well, not very. You know, I act like this is all there is, like, oh, this is the most important, and I realize some things are difficult. I don't want to downplay those. I'm there with you, but I try to remember, this isn't all there is. How different would my life be? How different? What would be different about my life if I didn't believe in Jesus' resurrection in terms of my priorities in this life? Shouldn't our lives be radically different than people who think this is all there is? You know, live life, get all you can, because when it's done, it's done. He who dies with the most toys wins. You know what? Yeah, you still die. But if you thought this was all there was, okay, I'm all for you. You've got it. What a way, that would be the way to live life if this was all there is. But how different is my life from that? Because I believe, as a Christian, I believe there is an eternity. And then the same thing, the urgency in light of eternity. How urgently do I feel the need to connect with other people? Because there is going to be a judgment. Everyone's getting out of Hades, but it's only good news for the people who personally accepted Christ. How urgently do I feel the need to connect with people? And maybe how urgently do I feel the need to accept it myself, to believe, repent, and be baptized? Because it's there. Again, Jesus says, I've got some good news. I have the keys to the gates of Hades. Everyone's getting out. Well, at least it's good news for those who've accepted it. Because everyone's going to be judged. But if our name's written in the book of life, that is not meant to undermine our assurance. Have I done enough? No, have I accepted Christ? And so, as we close, I always have here, start to live it out. How do we live out this eternal perspective? How do we apply that to our lives? Again, we know it. We believe it. Most of us, I'm sure we believe Jesus died, he rose, we're spending eternity in heaven. How do we apply that to day-to-day lives? And one idea I had to help get our thoughts going as we discuss this, we're all familiar with the WWJD bracelets. What would Jesus do? I thought about it. How about we ask, what has Jesus done? As I face this situation, I know what he would do. He's perfect. But what has Jesus done? And how does that impact? The fact that he's died and risen and he's in eternity waiting for me, how does that change my perspective? How does that help me live the life I need to? How do we apply this eternal perspective?